Yes, Dr. Nigel, please.
Okay, so what we've talked about so far have been the concepts behind the process approach. But ISO 9001 actually specifies requirements that need to be implemented if we are actually to adopt this process approach. And it does that in clause 4.4, which talks about the quality management systems and its processes. The first thing it says is we need to determine, to think about, to define what are the processes that we need in our organization for the quality management system, and how do they apply throughout the organization? Well, every organization is different. And so if you're a service organization, then the service delivery processes that you need to manage may be very different from a manufacturing organization. And if you are in the public sector, the way that you have public accountability may mean that the way you manage your processes have to be more, I hate to use the word bureaucratic, but they have to be better documented, because somebody is going to come along and say, are you making good use of the taxpayers' money? Are you actually doing this in a proper way? Have you been through a tendering process for a particular kind of purchase? Which, if you are in a private sector, let's say a small family-owned company, and I own that company, I can just go out and buy from whoever I want. I don't necessarily need to go through a detailed formal tendering process. So that is something that is very specific to individual organizations. What are the processes needed? Of course, there are some that are common to all organizations, things like determining competence and ensuring competence, which normally, but not necessarily always, includes some training. There will be a service delivery process. There will be a process for dealing with non-conformities, a process for dealing with customer complaints, and so on. We need to define what are the inputs required and what are the outputs expected from these processes. Well, if we think about, and if you consult ISO 9000, then the definition of effectiveness is the ability to achieve the planned results. So if we think about how we are going to manage that process, then we should have some way of measuring whether that process is actually achieving what we expected. Is it achieving the outputs? In other words, is it effective? And I like this little cartoon here where we've got, the two worker ants with a very, very detailed, well mapped out process, but then they're expecting some miracle to occur so that they will achieve the planned results and the customer will be happy. Well, it doesn't work like that. We need to think throughout the whole process. We need to think about the sequence and the interaction of these processes. Well, actually, we need to do more than just think about it. We need to define them, because this is now a requirement of ISO 9001. So if you are looking to implement and achieve certification to ISO 9001, it's no longer enough just to say, oh, we adopt a process approach. We use risk-based thinking. We use the plan, do, check, act cycle. No, you now need to demonstrate that you are doing all these things that ISO 9001 requires. And ISO 9001 requires by using the word shall. So for example, in clause 4.4, it says the organization shall determine the processes that are needed for its quality management system. So if I'm coming along to audit you, I will say, show me, where have you determined the processes that are needed? Typically, that may be in the form of process maps. It may be in the form of a quality manual, although a specific quality manual is no longer a requirement of ISO 9001, or it may be through a procedures manual or some other means. But if you want to claim conformity to ISO 9001, you have to be able to demonstrate that you are meeting every one of the shalls in the standard itself. You shall define the criteria and the methods to manage that process, including how are you going to monitor it? What measurements might you need to take? What are the relevant performance indicators for that process? To know if that process is being carried out effectively. What are the resources that you need? And ensure their availability. Human resources, financial resources, energy resources, infrastructure, and so on. It may be IT infrastructure or whatever. You need to define the responsibilities and authorities for those processes. Who is actually has the authority to make a change in the process? Who is responsible if something is not happening according to plan? Not to point the finger and blame the person and punish the person, but to be able to manage and say, what went wrong? How can we do it better next time? Address the associated risks and opportunities. As I said earlier, not every process needs to be managed with the same degree of rigor. We may have some processes that are not so important and we just get on with them, and we don't need very much documentation or monitoring or measurement or very strict qualification requirements for who's carrying them out. But we may have other processes that are so critical that we need to go through a validation process. We need to test the process. We need to ensure that people have the right qualifications to be able to carry out that process. Whether it's from the perspective of quality, which is what we're talking about here, but we can apply the same logic to environmental management or to health and safety management. Is this a process that is highly risky of somebody getting injured? Is it a process where there is a big risk of environmental pollution? So from those different contexts, we decide how much planning and how much control we need of those processes. And then we need to evaluate the process. Is it doing what it was set out to do? Are there any changes needed to the process? And then finally, even if everything is working okay, we shouldn't just stop there. We should always be asking ourselves, always questioning ourselves, is there a better way to do this? How can we improve the process to make it faster, cheaper, better, more environmentally friendly, safer, and in the context of the quality management principle, better capable to achieve customer satisfaction? So some typical questions we need to ask ourselves, you need to ask yourselves when you are implementing a quality management system. What are the processes that are needed for our quality management system? Are any of these processes outsourced? If you do outsource some of the processes, whether it's in the context of a university, it may be catering services, it may be cleaning, you may be outsourcing some of your teaching arrangements or some of your IT infrastructure. That doesn't just mean that you can wash your hands of it and say, oh, we can't do anything about that because it's outsourced. You need to manage the way that those outsourced providers actually meet the requirements of your quality management system. Because as your customer, I don't care whether it's outsourced or not. For me, it's the University of Sierra Leone that's providing me with this particular training. And it's no good if I say, sorry, I'm not happy with the training, and you come back to me and say, well, very sorry, sir, but that's outsourced, so we can't do anything about that. I'm paying you, or I'm receiving from you, I've enrolled as a student, and I expect to receive a good product. Who are the customers of each process? And we talked about that earlier. Who are the internal customers and or the external customers? What are their requirements? What do they expect from the process? What are the characteristics of the process that will allow that process to meet their needs and expectations? It may be accuracy of a report, it may be the timeliness of a report, it may be the ease of reading a report, or it could be any number of factors. Who is the owner of the process? This is not a specific requirement of ISO 9001, but it's very good practice to determine a process owner. Somebody who, regardless of what department they sit in, they are responsible for the overall process interactions from start to finish. So again, if we think back to that earlier example of purchasing, who is the owner of the purchasing process? Is it somebody in the manufacturing area? Maybe the case of maintenance. Maybe maintenance do their own purchasing and purchase their own spare parts without necessarily going through a central purchasing office. But somebody has to be able to look at it, looking outside of the departmental boundaries. So what are the inputs and outputs for each process? What's the sequence and interaction? How can we describe this? How can we describe our process? And we talked earlier about process mapping, process flow charts, which can be very, very good ways of doing that. And finally, what documentation do we need? So that, for me, is always almost the final question. First, we have to understand the process. We have to understand the implications, and then we start thinking about what do we need in terms of work instructions, in terms of standard operating procedures, or whatever, to ensure that the processes are carried out in a consistent manner. Remember, those processes needed for the quality management system should include the management activities, provision of resources, product realization or service delivery processes, which is the core of any organization, measurement processes, and when an organization outsources any process that affects its ability to consistently provide conforming products and services, it must ensure that those processes are controlled. Identify the control of those processes within the quality management system. That doesn't mean that you have to go out and watch over every individual step that a subcontractor or an outsourced service provider is doing. You build up confidence over time. It may be somebody that you've used for the last 10 years or the last 20 years, and you know that they will always provide you with a good service. Then you don't necessarily need to watch over them the whole time. But if it's somebody who is providing an outsourced product or an outsourced process for the first time, then maybe you need to be a little bit extra vigilant until you build up that confidence in the outsourced provider. So that's just one subclause that we've looked at of ISO 9001. But if you understand that and you look at that from a holistic point of view, then that is the foundation of the quality management system. Now, as I said earlier, different organizations have different contexts, and there are implications for those organizations. That is set out in the first clause of ISO 9001, which talks about the external context in which an organization is situated. University of Sierra Leone is not in Chicago or in London or in Addis Ababa or in Sao Paulo, Brazil. It's in Freetown, Sierra Leone. You have your own culture in your country, which has to be respected. So those external factors can relate to the legal context, technological infrastructure, maybe competition or not, market, cultural, social, economic environments, either at the very, very specific Freetown context, or the Sierra Leone context, or the regional West Africa context. And then we have the internal context, which relates to the history and the values and the traditions of USL, your knowledge that you've built up over the years, and the overall performance of the organization. And I think this little diagram here gives a very good example. People are looking at an elephant, at a picture of an elephant, and each one just sees a little separate part. sometimes you need to take a step back to be able to see the whole, to be able to see what's important. Major differences in different kinds of organizations. The major difference between different sizes and types of organization is the number and complexity of the quality management system processes. You know, a small and medium enterprise, let's say a small shop selling office supplies on the corner of a street there in Freetown, it doesn't need an extremely heavy bureaucratic documented system. On the other hand, a large complex organization making sophisticated engineering components with safety critical applications, we would expect them, because of the nature of their business, to have a much heavier documented, more formal, more rigorous quality management system. And so that also relates to the number and complexity of the product realization processes. Now, we may have a very large company, let's say in the shoe manufacturing business, 7,000 employees, but their product realization process, it's one, making shoes, and there is a production line and everybody is doing the same thing over and over again. It's not a highly complex process. It's a repetitive process, and we can manage it in different ways than if it's, let's say, a sophisticated engineering company that's doing one-off projects for particular construction work or government-related projects. And finally, the way in which those processes are managed, how formal, how informal, how rigorous, how flexible. And that leads us into the question of documentation. ISO 9001 says, to the extent necessary, the organization shall maintain documented information to support the operation of its processes. Remember that phrase very, very importantly. The documentation there is to support the operation of the process. It's to retain documented information, which traditionally we call records, to have confidence that the processes are being carried out as planned. It may be some kind of monitoring information. It may be some measurements that are taken during the process to show that we are meeting the specified criteria for a particular piece of equipment, or that we are meeting the schedule requirements for a particular customer. So who decides how much documentation? It's the organization. It's you. ISO 9001 gives you a lot of flexibility in how you document your system. But it is very, very rigorous in what you have to achieve. So to achieve certification, you have to be able to demonstrate with objective evidence that the processes are effective. So in other words, how you are actually planning and carrying out and measuring your process actually ensures that those processes are doing what they're supposed to do. That very often, not always, but that very often inevitably will require you to have some procedures, some work instructions and records to show that things have been done correctly. Now, in highly regulated industries, for example, in the aviation business or in the transport or the telecommunications sector, it's quite normal for the regulator to require a lot of documentation. The pharmaceutical business, for example, you have to be able to demonstrate before you can put a new drug on the market that it is safe for consumers to use. And that will require a lot of documentation. It's not ISO 9001 that directly is saying you have to document this. But what ISO 9001 says is that you have to recognize that if you are going to meet the requirements of the regulator, they require you to do this, and therefore your ISO 9001 quality management system requires you to do it. So ISO 9001 is very, very flexible on the documentation it requires, but it does require you to understand your customers and what they require and the regulatory context in which you are operating. So when we look at the history of ISO 9001, we can see that it's evolved over the years rather than undergoing revolutions. ISO 9001 was first published in 1987 with a very small revision in 1994. That was a very prescriptive standard. It had 20 clauses, and for each one of those clauses, you were required to have a documented procedure, and you were required to come up with records to show that you were following that procedure. That's because of the history of ISO 9001. It was very much came up through the manufacturing, the defense kind of industry, very, very manufacturing focused. When we made the first major revision to ISO 9001 in the year 2000 and the much, much more minor revision in 2008, that was the first time we adopted this process approach. We said organizations aren't built up around 20 clauses of the standard. You know, there's no department clause 4.1 or a department clause 7.2. Departments are means to an end of ensuring that processes are carried out effectively. And so with this process approach, there was much less prescribed documentation in that standard. And then we take it one step further, and in the year 2015, it's very, very much performance-based. Is the process being managed to achieve the objectives for which it was designed? You may be surprised to learn that ISO 9001 2015 has zero, I repeat, zero prescribed requirements for documented procedures. There are a number of requirements in ISO 9001 for records that show whether a process has been carried out effectively or not. But that doesn't mean that you don't need any documentation. It means that you have to think for yourselves. What documentation do I require in my organizational context for me to have confidence that my processes are operating effectively and for me to be able to transmit that confidence to my customers and to other interested parties? And we do that using process mapping, understanding process interactions, risk-based thinking, having those that higher risk processes typically will have more documentation, a greater degree of formality with them. And then we balance it all using the plan, do, check, act cycle. So it may be that we've looked at a particular process and we said, well, that's easy. We don't need any work instructions or anything for that. And so we start operating that process with no defined documented procedures, but we start to see things going wrong. And we start to see that people on one shift are doing it differently from people on a different shift, or there is a big variation in equipment. And we see that, hey, maybe here, in order to solve that problem, we need to go back and we need to develop additional work instructions or standard operating procedures and so on. So that's where the plan, do, check, act cycle comes in. Manufacturing organizations, these are the traditional focuses of ISO 9000, and 9001 2015 gives much more flexibility to define what is important. Focus on the process, focus on the results, greater flexibility in terms of documentation needs, and look at ways to improve. Service organizations, how do we define service? Well, ISO calls a service something where at least one activity is necessarily performed at the interface between the organization and its customer. It may be a car rental agency. It may be a university, where if you're in the middle of a lecture, typically you can't say, hold on a minute, just wait, I want to go back and think about what I said, and I want to inspect it before I actually say it. It's instantaneous. It's in real time. You can't have the luxury that sometimes you can have in manufacturing, where you do inspection, test, release, and you say, okay, now this product can go out to the customer. In many, many face-to-face service contexts, this is being done in real time. And if something goes wrong, the customer detects it immediately. So there is a need to be dynamic. It's characterized by what we call special processes. It's important to have good design and development of the service that's to be delivered. When we talk about special processes, I won't go into any detail in this part of the course, but we will be coming back to discuss that further. Basically, a special process is one where you cannot measure or monitor it before it's actually delivered to the customer. If we think about a hotel is a service-based organization. The real-time interaction between the receptionist and the hotel guest who's checking in is a special process. We have to make sure that the person who is on reception is competent. We have to validate possibly the computer program that's used to direct the guest to a vacant room and so on. Whereas the housekeeping, the cleaning process, when I get up and leave the hotel in the morning, then the housekeeping department can clean my room, they can change the sheets on the bed, they can change the towels, and it's possible to actually inspect that before I come back in the afternoon or in the evening back to the room. So that would not be what we call a special process. It's possible to actually inspect it before it gets delivered to the customer. And there are quite significant implications of that. And then finally, we have small businesses, small and medium enterprises. Typically, we have good top management commitment, because very often top management is the owner, or the owner's son, or the owner's grandson. Family businesses, very simple communication processes. No need for long, complex communication procedures. Probably very few quality management system processes, and absolutely need to avoid bureaucracy. Sometimes, I've seen small businesses being put off ISO 9001 because they've hired a consultant who's worked all his or her life in a multinational large manufacturing company, and they come into this small business and they create a bloated, hyper bureaucratic system full of too much documentation that becomes meaningless in the context of that small business. And of course, few resources. So small businesses need to make maximum use of the resources they have available, and they can afford to be a little bit informal. Large organizations, on the other hand, many, many more processes, more layers of management. So policy deployment may be more difficult. There may be more extensive communication needs, particularly for a multinational that's operating in different countries and on different continents. Typically, a need for greater formality. There are many, many more people doing similar tasks, and so therefore we need to have a routine, we need to have a standard way of carrying out those tasks that can be used as a basis for training. So I hope that's given you a good awareness that defining and managing processes is a fundamental requirement of ISO 9001:2015. Those processes may be functional or they may be interfunctional. Quality management system processes include, but go way beyond just the operation service delivery processes. The amount of documentation needs depends on the size of the organization, the complexity of the process, and the competence and experience of its personnel. The important message here, all organizations are different. So with that, let's give you your assignment for this part of the course. And what I'd like to do is build on the previous assignments And I'd like to ask you to think about what are the processes needed for the quality management system in your organization, University of Sierra Leone, or in your particular part of the university. Make a list, and please do this individually. Make a list of what you see as the sort of core service delivery processes. And then think about the management system processes. How is that service delivery managed? What planning needs to go into that? What kind of processes are there for defining the overall policies and the objectives of the university? And support processes, like it may be human resources, or it may be something as simple as the restaurant or transport, or the people who operate the facilities within the university. And then think about how you might set about managing those processes and their interactions. How much documentation is needed? What level of detail is needed? That level of detail may differ from one department to another, depending on the nature of the courses that are being offered, depending on the nature of the students, depending on the capabilities of the teachers, of the professors. So I'd like you to work individually, but then to feedback and present and discuss your assignments with your colleagues. And what I hope is that at the end of this, you will have an embryo, the starting point of a quality management system for USL. So with that, let me pass back to Shaukat to close out this session. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Shaukat.
Thank you, Dr. Nigel, for this wonderful lecture. And I think the concept of the process and the process mapping, starting from module 1 up to module 2, now would have been developed for the University of Sierra Leone. And it was visible when you submitted the assignment number 1 that most of the faculty member have sent the assignment in very good shape. Yes, there is some improvement. I'm hopeful that in the assignment number 2 that Dr. Nigel has briefed you now in detail, you would be very much clear and you would do your best effort to submit assignment number 2 in more appropriate way. With respect to this concept is wonderful, and I think the process, without the concept of the process and the process mapping, you cannot move towards any standard. And as for the quality management, ISO 9001 is the key standard, but for this key standard, process and the process mapping understanding is the master key. You cannot open and you cannot move without this master key towards implementation and towards better understanding of the ISO 9001. I'm hopeful now with so much excellent delivery, you are in better position to understand process and the process mapping. Please focus on this assignment, and I am hopeful that as soon as you will move toward this assignment, maybe your both assignments we will discuss as a new interactive lecture along with the Dr. Nigel. But I would request all of you to be more present during the question and answer session, to be more present in listening these valuable lectures in focused way, and to be more committed so that in the coming future we may launch this quality management system from at University of Sierra Leone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Nigel, for this wonderful contribution.
Thank you.
And see you soon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Yeah.
All right.